Okay, so first of all, it's not clear he was the shooter. He may have been a patsy, but let's come back to that, okay? Before we get there, what we know is that the CIA knows what's going on with him. They know that they're setting up Oswald for PR purposes, and they know they are very angry with JFK. So at some point during this time, a plot develops probably, 4 weeks or so before the assassination to have a tactical team of 2 Cubans go in and take out JFK.
Welcome back to Just the Facts with me, Jill Wine-Banks, the Watergate girl, wearing, of course, my Just the Facts badge, based on my badge from when I was the Deputy Attorney General of Illinois. And today we have a very exciting episode for you. It's about the evidence that's just been revealed about the JFK assassination, which is definitely not getting the attention that it deserves. We've had over 60,000 pages already released, and there may be up to 20,000 more pages coming, including from the FBI. My guest, Jim Robenalt, is not only a presidential scholar, but he has actually read a lot of those documents so that you don't have to. And he's going to share with us his knowledge. So Jim is a presidential historian. He appears in an unlikely place for me to have someone on from, and that is Fox Now. But he is someone who understands the importance of facts, and so it is appropriate to have him on Just the Facts, despite his affiliation with Fox. But I love that he is here, and I know that he will share his facts with us. He is also better known to me as a lawyer with a national law firm. He concentrates his practice on trade secrets and economic espionage. And espionage will be a word that we'll use in a different way in today's episode. He's also the author of 4 terrific books. Please Google him and look at his books. They are all unbelievably fascinating stories told, although they're history, they're told as stories. And he also is a lecturer with John Dean about ethics as a result of Watergate and the changes that happened. And I hope we're going to have time today to talk not just about the JFK assassination documents and what it means, but also about what's happening in terms of ethics at the Department of Justice and their now merger with the White House, where I just saw Pam Bondi giving a press conference standing in front of the White House. Completely horrible to me. Anyway, the most important thing about Jim is that I consider him my friend. So he is the perfect guest for today's episode of Just the Facts. And welcome, Jim.
Hi, Jill. Now, you've got to correct the record here. I'm from a New Deal family, strong Democrats.
Yes.
But I have been on Fox, their live streaming, not really their network channel, only a couple times there. But the live streaming's pretty good because they just let you talk and you want to go where the people are. So I've been happy to be affiliated with them.
I was, of course, joking because I know your politics. But the important thing is that you talk facts on Fox Now, which is the streaming service, and you will be talking facts today. And you have been studying this JFK assassination for a long time. You're not just starting with these newly released documents, but you've looked at it for a long time, and you can share with us what I didn't expect to find, which was that there are some revelations there that are really interesting. And I want to go through them sort of one at a time because they reveal things that may implicate the U.S. government in Kennedy's murder. Anyway, I was shocked to see that there might be something to the conspiracy theories, but completely different than the conspiracies that I think we were expecting or that have been talked about before. So let's talk today about, first of all, some of the information that has been revealed in these new documents. Let's talk about what the CIA's role is, both as an intelligence gathering unit and as an operations unit. And what does the White House's rush to publish these documents without thinking about what they were releasing, so that they included Social Security numbers of living people, which could endanger them, of course. And I mention this because this isn't the only thing where they have been careless. They just had a conversation on a non-secure site. I mean, Signal has some security, but they were using their personal phones. One of them was in a car. One of them was in Moscow when they had these conversations. So the worst part of that was that they carelessly added a reporter, an editor of The Atlantic, Jeffrey Goldberg, onto this conversation about the possible war plans against the Houthis. So I want to start, though, with your conclusion. You wrote an article for Vanity Fair, an excellent piece. Everybody should read it. But you end with a sentence, basically, I'll read it, was that the CIA had a role in John F. Kennedy's assassination. So let's try to go through point by point. What is your evidence to support that? What are the things that make sense to you as to why you could safely say it was the CIA?
Let me go back and let me just set the table a little bit here. Number one, I started really seriously working on the JFK matter several years ago when I worked with Jackie Kennedy's Secret Service agent, a guy named Paul Landis. And he wrote a book about finding the pristine bullet in the limousine behind where Kennedy was sitting. And I wrote a long 8,000-word piece for Vanity Fair in 2023, which is like one of the most read articles that year.
Vanity Fair says it was the most read article. And basically the summary of that is that this bullet debunks the theory that the bullet passed through John F. Kennedy to hit Connally because there was this other bullet.
Right. So I continued working on that. And then in that process, I ended up getting in touch with these guys who work with it's called the Mary Farrell Foundation, Ferrell. Mary Farrell was a young woman in Dallas when the assassination happened. She ended up having money, and she created this foundation that collects all of the primary materials. So if you want to read the Warren report, you go to that site, you can pull it up. If you want to read any document in the 18 volumes, you can pull it up. It's a wonderful site. And by the way, it also covers Watergate too. I used it for that. So it's a great site. It's fact-based. And one of the guys who's a vice president there, who I like a lot, who is a very careful journalist from Washington Post, is named Jefferson Morley. Jefferson has been following this for 3 decades. He's very much focused on the CIA and a guy named James Angleton, who was the counterintelligence chief, very kind of famous, infamous, ended up getting fired by the CIA after the Church Committee, or during that time of the Church Committee. So Jefferson's a guy that is my gold standard, and he has been looking at these documents. I've been looking at these documents, and he's written about it. So if you ever want to go see facts about all this, go to his Substack called JFK Facts.
So let me stop you for a second, because before we confuse people, I just want to identify particular things. Now, you mentioned there's Watergate. Most people would not identify Watergate, which happened 10 years after Kennedy was assassinated, with his assassination. Right. And this fascinated me, and I want to cover that when we get to it in the chronological sequence. And you haven't mentioned it yet, but Cuba is a key player in this. And most people will go, what does Cuba have to do with the assassination of JFK or Lee Harvey Oswald, who is, of course, the person who has been identified as the shooter? Yeah. So let's go through all of those things. And you mentioned James Angleton, who was counterintelligence chief. And the reason you mentioned him is that if from reading your article, you considered him to be one of the things that will be released that is a bombshell, which is his testimony in secret will now be released to the transcript of his testimony at the time.
Right. So when I wrote this article for Vanity Fair, what I said is JFK inherited 2 big, severe problems when he became president. One was the CIA, and the other was Cuba. So when he came into the presidency, Eisenhower had already planned an operation that ended up being the Bay of Pigs operation, an invasion of Cuba by exiles who had principally gathered in Miami. And they then tried to invade Cuba to depose Castro. This was planned by Eisenhower, inherited by JFK, but the operational group that was putting it all together was the CIA. They had a station in Miami. They were working with all these exiles, and they became very much the operational arm of this, of this invasion. It failed, and it failed because of bad planning by the CIA, but also once it started to go bad, Kennedy realized he'd been sold a bill of goods, and he withheld American air power to support it. So this did two things. I mean, first of all, it made him really despised by the Cubans, because 100 of them were killed.
By the Cuban exiles.
Yeah, the Cuban exiles. 14 were, they were captured and tortured and so forth. And so they were really upset with JFK failing at the last minute to support this operation. But it was poorly planned, and he knew that the CIA had bungled it. So he then asked his assistant, Arthur Schlesinger Jr., to do a long memo on how can we reorganize the CIA. That is to, really, he said, scatter it into 1,000 pieces. It started as a group that was supposed to get intelligence, and it ended up being both an intelligence gathering, covert operation, but also then operating as a covert entity. And that's what he was upset about. So right away, you've got this friction between Kennedy and the CIA, and Kennedy and the anti-Castro movement. Kennedy would fire a guy named Allen Dulles, who was the head of the CIA, who, coincidentally not, ends up as one of the Warren commissioners in this whole thing. So that's how kind of it starts. And so we're into the Cuban problem for JFK. The CIA continues to press him to get rid of Castro. He wants to get rid of Castro, but now they turn to an assassination.
And for anyone listening, let me just stop you there. The reason he wanted to get rid of Castro is because 90 miles off our coast was a communist country. And there was the discomfort of that. So that was why. And the Cuban exiles here in America had fled the country because their property had been seized by the Castro regime, and they were very anti-Castro. And I just want to link in right now Watergate. And that's because the Bay of Pigs, part of the people involved in Bay of Pigs, were the Watergate burglars. Yeah. They were all CIA operatives, maybe CIA operatives, but they were all involved in the invasion, which failed.
They were all out of this Miami station, and your favorite guy, Howard Hunt, was kind of in charge of them. And then when Watergate happens, he brings them to Washington to be the people to invade the Democratic National Headquarters, because 10 years later, they still hated the Democrats and Teddy Kennedy, and they would do anything to get back at the Democrats. That's why they were involved in the Watergate break-in. And we can come back to that and talk about the specifics and how
now let's link all of this to the Kennedy assassination.
Yeah.
The Cubans hated him, but the Cubans didn't shoot him. Lee Harvey Oswald did. So how is Lee Harvey Oswald involved with the Cubans? And why are we talking about Cuba?
Yeah. So you go through two more stages. The next stage to get Castro out is an assassination operation that was called Project Mongoose, again, headed by the CIA.
And this was not a Kennedy assassination. This was an assassination of Fidel Castro. And they went and got Johnny Roselli out of Chicago, a mobster, to help them put it together. There were poison pills that were sent down to Miami to be sent over to a restaurant that Castro went to. Bobby Kennedy knew about and approved this operation. And there's a lot of evidence that JFK may have known about it too. So they went from like full-scale military invasion to, well, why don't we just assassinate him? And that's going on. Now, all of that is percolating while the Cubans in Miami, through CIA money and help, and they were funded entirely by the CIA, were infiltrating at times with boats and things like that. So during this time, Castro then obviously understands what's going on, and he asked the Soviets to send some nuclear missiles to Cuba so he can prevent being invaded by the Americans. And, Khrushchev was more than happy to do so. That leads to October of '62 and the Cuban Missile Crisis. When that happens, JFK
again, has a second opportunity to invade Cuba and get rid of Castro. And the top brass want him to do so, push him to do so. Obviously, the anti-Castro forces in Miami hope that this is the moment, and he doesn't. He makes a deal with Khrushchev in which he says America will not invade Cuba. So this is like strike two for Kennedy with the Cuban exiles. They're now really upset. They think he's the problem. Their families are being tortured and executed. This is a real problem, and the CIA has been funding it. Now JFK says, after Bay of Pigs, stop funding these guys on the infiltration and exfiltration of the island. Let's take the temperature down, and that really, really upsets them. So at this point, you've got these guys who the CIA has trained very carefully. A lot of them are marksmen, but they're paramilitary people, and they've been trained in Central America, Louisiana, and so you've got them armed, trained, and really angry with Kennedy, believing he's in the way of liberating Cuba. And the CIA is kind of caught in this in the middle, but they are watching things progress and they're not doing anything about it. So then we get to the couple months before the assassination. So in the summer of 1963, Oswald, who we haven't introduced yet, but who's a Marine, he's 24 years old, ex-Marine that is, had defected to Russia, came back with his wife, moved to Dallas.
Who was Russian, right?
Who was Russian, yep. Marina, and moves back to New Orleans to find a job in the summer of 1963. And you can see this stuff on, Oliver Stone's JFK movie.
Yes.
This is in there. And he's out doing fair play for Cuba, handbills. And the Cubans want to make sure that they record this, that, the stations are there. They then invite him for a long radio interview. They want to set him up and to manipulate him at this point as someone who is pro-Castro for their own uses, whatever. At that point, whether an assassination was underway, a plot with Kennedy, I don't think so. I think that came a little bit later, but they were setting him up to be used for PR purposes. Here's a guy who's pro-Castro and he's nuts, and, this is what's going on. And by the way, when they get him on the radio program, they ambush him by saying, didn't you defect to Russia? Aren't you Russian? So now they're trying to tie Russia again to Cuba in a way that is nefarious. So they're setting him up. And that takes place in, the summer of 1963. CIA people all over it, people from that Miami station, the exiles all over it. So we know, and this is coming out in these documents, Jill, the stuff that we're seeing now in the last 10 years and as of a couple days ago. So then we get to 6 weeks before the assassination. Oswald goes to Mexico City to try to get a visa to go to Cuba. He wants to be part of the Cuban Revolution. He wants to send his troublesome wife back to Russia with their child. He may join him there. He may not. He wants to get to Cuba. And so he goes there and he goes to the Cuban embassy.
And he couldn't go through America because it was illegal to travel. So he went to Mexico to the Cuban embassy.
Exactly. It became illegal for Americans to travel to Cuba. And so a lot of people went through Mexico City and got on the airlines down there to go to Havana. So he's down there, but he can't go unless he has a visa. So he goes to the Cuban embassy and interacts with a woman who becomes a real figure in the assassination investigation, asking her help. She says, well, you can come temporarily to Cuba, but if you're going to Russia, you got to have the Russians say they will accept you after your temporary time in Cuba. So he goes over to the Russian embassy. There he interacts with a guy who's a whether he knows it or not, is a KGB officer who is in charge worldwide of assassination plots. So this plot can't get any thicker at this point, and what we now know and what these documents are showing us is
this is the key point. If you're listening now, this is key.
The CIA is following him and they are photographing him. They are intercepting phone conversations. And this is part of several operations where he is on their radar screen. All this information is put together in a 181-page dossier that is given to the head of counterintelligence, this guy, James Angleton, and is on his desk the day of the assassination. So
okay, let me stop you there. So the CIA, and there are documents in this newly released tranche that show photographs of him at the Cuban embassy in Mexico and at the Russian embassy. There's evidence that he was meeting with the head of assassinations for the Russian embassy, a KGB agent. But again, that was in connection with his wanting to help Castro.
Yeah. Yeah.
So how do we get from that to him being the shooter of John Kennedy?
Okay. So first of all, it's not clear he was the shooter. He may have been a patsy, but let's come back to that. Okay. Before we get there, what we know is that the CIA knows what's going on with him. The CIA knows that and they're feeding information to these expats too. They know that they're setting up Oswald for PR purposes, and they know they are very angry with JFK. So at some point during this time, a plot develops, probably, 4 weeks or so before the assassination, to have a tactical team of 2 Cubans go in and take out JFK. And whether Oswald's involved in that wittingly and knows what's going on and actually shoots a gun, or whether he doesn't, this evidence is starting to really pile up that he may not have known about that. He may have been unwitting, and these guys worked him because they wanted to eventually set it up. Once the assassination happens, they immediately call the media, these expats, these people out of the Miami station, and say, Oswald did it. He was pro-Castro. He was part of a pro-Castro hit squad. And we know that because he was in Mexico City. Well, nobody knew he was in Mexico City except the CIA. So one view of this is Oswald was entirely set up and Cubans carried it out. Another is that Oswald was involved with the Cubans in the assassination plan, plot. But what is clear is there were multiple shooters that day. And that comes back to Paul Landis, who found the bullet behind where Kennedy had been sitting that fell out of his back. It didn't go through him into Conley. And we know from the Zapruder film that there was not enough time between the time that Kennedy reacts to the shot in the back, which Paul tells me was like seeing him get hit with a baseball bat in the back. You see his arms raised like this, his fists raised like this. When that happens, Conley is hit within a second. Well, it takes 3 seconds to bolt and reload and aim and fire. So Conley is hit by somebody else. It couldn't have been the same shooter who hit Kennedy in the back. And then the final shots probably came from an ambush of the grassy knoll, which Paul Landis said he heard the shot from up front. And he was not right
from the book depository.
Yeah, he said the final shot sounded very loud right in front. He later said he thought maybe it might have been an echo, but he reports this in his report that it was from the front. So I think there were multiple shooters at that point. And one of the Secret Service agents who was sitting in the front seat said it was a flurry of bullets flying at that point. So what happens is Oswald either is involved and is trying to get away when he's captured, or
so talk about where he was captured.
Yeah.
The widely accepted story is that he was the shooter from the book depository, a building along the presidential route. High up, he shoots. When was he captured? Was it the same day?
So he leaves right after the assassination. He's the only one who leaves of all the people in that building. He gets into a cab, gets into a bus, goes back to his apartment, grabs a pistol, and then makes his way to a theater where one side of the story says he was supposed to meet some Cubans there who were then going to fly him that day to Cuba, hijack. Remember when you used to have hijacked airplanes all the time by Cubans?
Yeah.
That they were going to fly him to Cuba. Another is that's just how he happened to get in there. But when he goes in, he goes and sits next to lots of people like, are you my contact? Are you my contact? Kind of thing. They eventually get him. They capture him, take him to police headquarters. And at that point, he says specifically on tape, you can hear it, I'm just a patsy. So he thinks that eventually he's going to get out of this somehow. And then this is Friday night, Saturday, and then Sunday morning, Jack Ruby kills him when he's
being transferred from one place to another.
Right.
And is encountered by Jack Ruby. Now, who is Jack Ruby and why did he kill him?
Well, this these are mysteries within mysteries within mysteries. It's an amazing story to that extent. But what we know about Ruby is he grew up in Chicago. Rubenstein was his name. He was kind of a gangster there, came to Dallas, started strip clubs, hung out with people who were affiliated with the mob, went to New Orleans many times, went to Cuba many times. And so his role in all this seems to have been somebody who was, they compartmentalize these people when they do this stuff. Somebody who was, told, you got to get rid of this guy. He's going to cause us trouble. And so the one side that thinks Oswald didn't know about it also think Ruby may not have known beyond where he was being instructed. But the evidence as it piles up looks more and more like the CIA knew what was going on and stood back, or knew what was going on and participated, but they definitely knew what was going on. And, what it would end up showing was that, CIA operations enabled these Cuban exiles to carry out this plot and then get away with it.
So Jim, this is a better spy story than any spy story I've ever read.
Yes.
But it's also more complicated. So tell me, as the good lawyer that you are, what's your closing argument to make the case that the CIA either knew and did nothing or knew and actively participated? And first of all, which of those sides would you take? Do you think they were just careless and lazy and just letting it happen? Or do you think they actively allowed this to happen?
I think the latter. I think they actively allowed it to happen.
Okay, so make that argument so that, a brief summary to the closing argument to the jury.
Okay, so we start off with the fact that the CIA is bankrolling these exiles in Miami and giving them money, giving them arms, training them, and so forth, and that both the CIA and the exiles become very unhappy with John F. Kennedy and believe that he's going to be a roadblock to getting rid of Castro. So we start with that fact. Then we go to the day of the assassination. One of these Cuban exiles, they were students, like doctors and so forth, but one of those exiles calls Claire Booth Luce, who is someone married to a guy named Henry Luce, who runs Time Life, the big media outlet. They call her because she had supported them financially, the exiles, giving them money for boats and that sort of stuff. And they call her that day. It's not like, days later. That day, they call her and they say, Oswald did it. We know it. He was in Mexico City threatening the president. And, you need to get this out, essentially. So if you read the newspapers that day, you'll see all of the newspapers say, pro-Castro rifleman kills the president. And this is exactly what they wanted. They wanted to have that out there.
But that was the Cuban activists wanted that. Why did the CIA want that?
Well, the CIA was supporting these guys. I mean, the CIA knew these guys and was involved with them. So the CIA they did not like Kennedy after he threatened to scatter them into 1,000 pieces after the Cuban Missile Crisis, and then fired, Allen Dulles, right. And he was hostile to the CIA, and I think they were pretty hostile to him. And there were people within the CIA who were very openly hostile to JFK too. There's several people named in all these books who are part of this. Now, here's where I then say to the jury, what do we know then? What we know is that the CIA began right away to lie about all of this. And they've withheld stuff until 60 years later. We're starting to see stuff for the first time. Why did they do that? Why did they lie about their involvement? They came before the Warren Commission, Richard Helms. I don't know if you ever met Richard Helms and anything. So Helms and a guy named McCone. Helms was the assistant. I think McCone was the director of the CIA. And they were asked about, Oswald. And Helms himself says, we had just minimal information on him. We didn't know anything about him. It wasn't really he wasn't on our radar screen.
And these documents prove the exact opposite, that they definitely knew.
Yeah, the documents show they had 6 different operations following him at that time. They were opening mail. They were doing all that stuff. And then we have Angleton, who, by the way, the Church Committee showed that the CIA was more than willing to assassinate leaders and change governments in Guatemala and Iran and so forth. They were running as a really dirty operation back then. And Angleton is the guy who knew all this stuff, who, when he's, asked about stuff by the Senate, ends up lying to them about the role of the CIA and what he knew. And then there's one other guy that we now know about who was running operations out of Miami. And he's a guy that Jefferson Morley has been trying to get his documents for a decade. He's had lawsuits to try and get the documents. That guy's documents are still not available to us. He was involved with all these expats in Miami, helping to run that station down there in an operation. And then guess what? Later on...
What's his name?
George Giannides. Joannides with a J. And there's a great bunch of articles. Jefferson Morley has written a lot about this, but there's also several other articles you can find if you look him up. That guy ends up showing up in 1978 when Stokes has the assassinations committee look at this assassinations and MLKs and RFKs, for a second time looking at the Warren Commission. Guess who is the CIA officer in charge of getting the information from the CIA to that committee, that House Select Committee? George Giannides. And guess who he told about his role in Miami during that time? Nobody. So the guy who was the lawyer at the time, whose name is Robert Blakey. I don't know if you...
Bob Blakey.
He was the guy who became the general counsel for the committee. Notre Dame law, the guy who came up with the RICO law and so forth. Blakey says that guy not disclosing what he knew was probably a federal crime. So this is a long campaign to keep hidden what the CIA knew about it. And so you got to ask the question, why were they doing that? And now that this stuff is coming out, we can see it's because they were so entangled with the Cubans who likely were involved in the assassination and using Oswald.
Okay, so I've been writing down a couple questions as you're talking, because not in any particular order, but you mentioned the CIA was funding the Cuban exiles who were anti-Castro and trying to take Castro down, which was consistent with U.S. policy of getting rid of a communist leader so close to our shores. I want to mention two things. One, of course, is the connection to Watergate, which is the follow the money. One of the most famous lines of Watergate, follow the money, was because the $100 bills in the pockets of the burglars when arrested in the DNC came from a check that one of them had cashed at his Miami bank before coming to Washington to commit the burglary, came from a campaign check to Committee to Re-elect the President, Richard Nixon, called CREEP. So there was a CREEP check cashed by the Cubans, and if the FBI had looked at where the money came from and the serial numbers could have been traced, they would have known immediately that CREEP was involved in the break-in. And that was the smoking gun tape, which says, get the CIA to stop the FBI, tell them there's national security implications, they can't follow the money. So there's that connection between the CIA, the Watergate. But I also want to mention...
And Jill, there's one more thing. There's one more thing. In that smoking gun tape, what is said is, don't tell them to turn off the FBI investigation, tell the CIA, because it will get into the Bay of Pigs thing.
Yes, that's true. Yes, that also.
And it's Howard Hunt that he's talking about. And
of course.
And this whole, and all the embarrassment, because Nixon knew about this stuff.
Right.
So it's directly related to the Bay of Pigs, the Cuban animosity, et cetera.
But the other thing I wanted to mention is, just for full disclosure, I took a year off between my first and second year of law school. I worked for an organization called the Assembly of Captive European Nations, which was set up during the time of the USSR or Soviet Union by the countries that had been taken over by the Soviets, who wanted their freedom back. They wanted to be independent countries, Poland, Hungary, Lithuania, etc. And I did not know at the time I worked for them but only when I was writing The Watergate Girl and did some research that the CIA funded ACEN. So I actually was also working for the CIA at one point in my career.
I knew it.
Totally no knowledge. I didn't know it. But
I always suspected that.
You always suspected. Well, what can I say?
But
there you go.
Here, let me just say something that I think is exceptionally telling and interesting, given what we now know about all this.
Yeah.
Including your dog barking.
Brisby likes to be part of things, and he wants to be a CIA operative.
Yeah, I don't think that's his real name. I think that's a code name.
It is. His real name is Brisbane because his father was Australian.
So 1 month after the assassination, the former president, Harry Truman, finally came forward and said something. He went to the funeral for JFK, but a month later, he did an editorial. You can look this up for the Washington Post. And he doesn't say, we've lost a great leader, we're all in great mourning. He says, we've got to do something about the CIA. That's the guy who started the CIA. And if you read his editorial, it's about this very point that Arthur Schlesinger made to Kennedy, that this is supposed to, he said, I started this group to be an intelligence gathering group to let the president know about stuff. And then the president and others would decide operations, particularly the State Department. But they are now, he says, involved in operational stuff, and it's getting us into trouble. I think he had a very high suspicion himself that somewhere behind all this stuff, the CIA was in back of it. And that's why that editorial comes out 1 month after the assassination. So it's extremely telling in my view.
Well, that's a good transition to the question of the CIA's role. We've explored why you feel comfortable saying it looks like the CIA was deliberately involved in this in the assassination of John F. Kennedy. But it also goes to your point about the role of the CIA as an intelligence gathering operation and as an operational unit with secret assets all over. And let's talk about that. What do you think should happen? Yeah. Should the CIA, we have Carol Leoning's writings about the Secret Service needs to be revamped because they've sort of missed their mark on what they were supposed to do. Yeah. And what about the CIA? What do you think?
This goes to one of the documents that just came out a few days ago. Arthur Schlesinger Jr., was part of Kennedy's group, right. Brilliant historian. I think he's Harvard undergrad. I think that's why Kennedy chose him. But he asked him to write this reorganization of the CIA, meaning he wanted to scatter it into 1,000 pieces. Part of that memo, 60 years later, was still blocked out by the CIA. So that just came out. What did it say? It said, we got a problem with the CIA because they are now overcoming the State Department in all our embassies. They're all CIA people who have State Department cover, but they now outnumber the State Department people, and they are dictating our foreign policy, and we can't have that. That's been under wraps for 60 years. The CIA continuously kept. So why did they do that? Because, they didn't want to have the spotlight on them. And as we know, what happened after JFK was the next real big thing we look at is 9/11. And 9/11 is a great intelligence failure, but it leads to the various acts that were put in place. And, we have the FISA court before that, but you have all this stuff in place. And then you create the Office of DNI, who Tulsi Gabbard is the head of. And
although she wouldn't admit the TG in the chat chain was actually Tulsi Gabbard.
Yeah,
really.
I know. So there you have another infusion of power and operation into the CIA. And what happens? Instead of just being an intelligence gathering group, they're now very much an operational group after 9/11. And what happens? Torture. Abu Ghraib. This idea of having covert operations separate and apart from just intelligence operations leads to this kind of abuse and leads to, the fact that these intelligence agencies are acting way beyond their sphere of where they should be acting.
Wow. This is an amazingly interesting, complex story that needs more. I'm glad that, hoping that Congress will do more to get the attention that this deserves as to what the role of the CIA was. And I, for one, and I'm sure you do too, remember exactly where I was in November when President Kennedy was assassinated. I was under a old-fashioned hair dryer with my hair in big rollers, because that was the style back then. I was still in college, and I'll never forget the moment that someone whispered under the dryer, "The president's been shot," and rushing back to my sorority house to watch television.
I mean, I was in second grade.
Oh, thanks a lot.
But I was in a Catholic school. My mother's mother was Nora Agnes Kelly, and her father, Timothy Kelly, came from Limerick, Ireland. That's exactly where John F. Kennedy's Fitzgerald family came from.
Oh.
So we, this was deep in our soul, this whole thing. And it was the event of my youth.
Yeah.
And at the time I thought, well, we'll get over it. And then I thought MLK and RFK, well, we'll get over it. We'll keep going. I think it had deep wounds that we still haven't figured out.
Oh, for sure. And RFK was assassinated the day of my law school graduation. Yeah. So again, I have firm memory of one of my best friends from law school calling to tell me the news just before I was about to receive my diploma. But let me see. Do we have time to talk at all? Yes, maybe a few minutes, because there's so many other topics. I just want to skim with you about one, this totally unrelated, but you interviewed one of my Watergate colleagues, Larry Hammond, who had clerked on the Supreme Court when the Roe decision was handed down. Right. And he is not always recognized as the person who really came up with the idea of the viability standard as the thing. So can you just, maybe 2 sentences about what you know about how that came to be, what the Supreme Court adopted as when abortions were still legal up to the point of viability?
Yeah, Larry, what a wonderful human being. We lost him a couple of years ago, but he was Lewis Powell's law clerk. And so I was writing this book on January 73, Watergate burglars trial, end of the Vietnam War, Lyndon Johnson dies, Truman dies, Nixon's second, inauguration, and Roe v. Wade.
Right.
And
it's a great book. It's such a fascinating confluence of events. Highly recommended.
Yeah. Larry, I contacted him. In fact, he came to one of the programs John Dean and I did in Phoenix. He was a lawyer out there for the Innocence Project. Just a sterling human being. And I said, I'm writing this book. Could I talk to you? And he said, yeah. He said, nobody has. And Justice Powell gave me permission to talk as long as I didn't talk about the other justices. So fortunately, there were a lot of memos that he did, and he gave me a long interview. And long and short is, Lewis Powell's the guy who came up with the viability standard in the deliberations, and I explained it all in the book. And he gets it from Larry Hammond, who recommended it to him. And the reason he recommended it to him, it's really interesting, is that William O. Douglas, Blackmun wanted to set the first trimester as the time beyond which abortions could be regulated, before which they couldn't. So the first 3 months. And Larry wrote a memo saying a lot of women who are inexperienced won't know they're pregnant, may not know they're pregnant, may be scared to tell their fathers or their, partners, and 3 months just isn't enough. And here's this lawsuit out of Connecticut that uses this viability standard. I think that would be the line. That ends up becoming Roe v. Wade. And that's
thank heavens for that. How prescient of him to do that. It was brilliant. And you just mentioned that he came to one of your programs. I just want to mention that you have an upcoming program in Columbus, Ohio. Just give us the date. It's at the Ohio Bar Association. Tell us what this. Yeah,
it's the Columbus Bar Association.
Columbus Bar Association. Okay, and the reason I want you to mention it is because I saw Pam Bondi giving a press conference right in front of the White House. She is not the president's lawyer. She is not representing the White House. She represents the people, and it is shameful. And you're going to be talking about the limits of the White House and Department of Justice, which are a result of rules put in place after Watergate when John Dean was getting evidence directly from the Department of Justice. So can you just talk about when that is so that people can come see it?
Yeah, there are a ton of legal reforms that came out of Watergate because all these lawyers got involved, including our model code. But one of the things that happened was this move to separate the Department of Justice from the White House on criminal prosecutions. And there's a policy in place. You can go look at the Justice Manual online. It's still there as far as I know as of this morning. But it just simply says this is 4 decades of being reaffirmed by attorneys general that we are not going to get into politics with respect to criminal prosecutions, and we need to keep this separation. So we're going to talk about that and how John himself, was dealing with the prosecutors, and that was getting back to the attorney general, and then getting to Nixon. And there was a guy named Henry Peterson who was calling him saying, here's what Dean's doing. I mean, there was just no separation, and that's what led to that policy.
And let me say, Henry Peterson was the boss of my first division. He was head of the organized crime section, later promoted to be head of the whole criminal division, and was clearly not politically astute, but was much admired by me originally, and then much disappointed by him as I discovered during Watergate the role that he had played. I was shocked.
Yeah, he was back channeling everything to Nixon, and it was too bad because, as you said, I mean, I think he came out of Bobby Kennedy's DOJ originally.
Yes,
and was very well liked. But man, these tapes, you can't do anything. These tapes are these tapes. There
I know he was. He had started. He was a career prosecutor, but had served under in the Bobby Kennedy administration. So it's a real shame, and I hope that people will pay attention to this and to how wrong it is for the Department of Justice to be cooperating with the White House. That is not how it's supposed to work. So and
by the way, law firms caving to the White House. That is an extreme. I mean, we could spend a whole session on that too, Jill.
My old firm, Jenner and Block, has not caved. They are still doing work. I'm disappointed, of course, in what Paul Weiss did. I've tried to communicate that to a friend of mine who is still affiliated with, who is a partner at Paul Weiss. It's just, and of course, my own law school, Columbia, has caved in ways that make me. I just got a fundraising request from Columbia today, and I wrote back saying, and not until you explain your behavior in caving to President Trump will I even consider giving any more money to Columbia. Yeah. So anyway, that's hopefully they're going to be hurt. I forwarded my answer to some of my law school classmates, and I hope anyone from Columbia who's listening will question why Columbia is doing that. But one last quick question before we end this episode, and we could go on forever because you're so interesting, Jim. But you also have done some work in election reform. And the reason I'm asking you about that is because there's a crucial election in Wisconsin, April 1st, for the Wisconsin Supreme Court. And it's a 5-4 court. Depending on the outcome of this, it will be 5-4 either Democrat or Republican. It can affect gerrymandering districts and whether or not they are fairly distributed. It can affect abortion rights in Wisconsin, depending on the outcome of this election. So it's a really key election. It's appalling how much money has been spent. A lot of it on the Republican conservative side is coming from Elon Musk. I understand that my Governor Pritzker, has contributed on the other side, as well as grassroots. I've worked with Ben Wickler, the head of the Wisconsin Dems, in trying to raise money for this race because I think it is crucial. What would be a better way to have judicial appointments or elections? What is your work on judicial reform?
Yeah, first of all, your governor should run for president.
I agree.
I love him. But in Cleveland, which is where I set up this commission, we elect like 36 judges every cycle. And people don't know what to do with those judgeships. They don't know how to evaluate people. There's very little information. It's all a name game. In Cleveland, if you're a Corrigan or a Russo, you end up getting elected just because of the name. So
Chicago too.
Yeah, I put together a group called judgeforyourself.com judgeforyourself.com, where we got all the bar people together, women's bar, African-American bar, major bar, a minor bar. All these bars got together and we interviewed these candidates. And a lot of people, who were there knew these candidates. And then we rated them. And we put that up on a website with the idea that we want people to have at least some information showing the various groups and how they, how the women saw it, how the African-American bar saw it, how the conservative bar saw it. Amazing similarity for the most part. There's, but people had a better idea then. And then the people who are just miserable were not being elected. So the main thing is educating people how to vote for judges, because it's very different. And judges aren't supposed to ethically be out there talking about how they're going to rule in cases.
Right.
So it's doubly hard to figure out who do you vote for.
But should we even be electing judges? Is there not a way that a nonpartisan group could get together and do gerrymander, could do redistricting, and could a separate group of experts could select who the judges should be? Yeah, there are subject to maybe recall.
There are states that do that. And, Indiana is a good example where they appoint their justices. And my own view has been mixed on it, but towards appointment, I think that's much more sensible, just because I think it's so hard for people to understand who they're voting for when they do vote. But I'm also a big, democracy guy, and people should decide stuff like this. But the states where there are appointments, they have pretty good justices and judges, and they do a pretty good job. And trying to separate out law from politics is our big struggle today, and will be in, the upcoming years. It's really important to separate that.
It's one of the most frequent questions that I'm asked around election time is, how do I get any information about who to vote for and who not to? And otherwise it's, I'll vote for all the women. Well, not all women are great. Not all Irish are great. It's, and that are criteria that are used in the Chicago voting for sure. And the bar associations, all of them, do separate evaluations and rank them as qualified or not qualified. And I will send people to all the various sites. And I have friends who will do a cross-check of, the Chicago lawyers say this, and to figure out who is really bad. And as you pointed out, that's the worst thing.
That's why I consolidated these groups.
Yeah, that's a brilliant idea.
The thing that really we found out is when we all sat in a room, like 90 of us, with somebody being interviewed, after they left, we would all talk, and people would say, well, I know them from this case or that case or whatever. It really worked out to be a great process, but we wanted to put it in one place rather than having people do what you're talking about, going to
Well, just one more of your many contributions to American justice and democracy. And I thank you for that. I recommend all of your books, and I recommend your writings at Vanity Fair, which are available. Just Google James, I call him Jim, but James Robenalt, Robenalt, and you will find all of his books. They are as fascinating written stories as you will ever find. Important issues. You have one also called, we haven't mentioned, Bullets Over Ballads. Another very, very interesting book. And your first one is what brought you in touch with John Dean, if I'm not mistaken. You both share an interest. Is this correct?
Well, the second one was the Warren Harding love letters.
Oh, I thought that was your first one. I'm sorry.
No, that was my first one was about a guy named Durbin, and my family is distantly related to your senator.
Our senator.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes, right. Okay, your second book about James Harding, very interesting, intimate portrait, I would say. Very worth reading. So look up James Robenalt and his books, and go to your local bookstore, your favorite independent store, or wherever else you get your books, and read his wonderful books. And I know you'll enjoy it. Thank you, Jim, for joining us today. I look forward to talking more, and say hello. We should mention that your wife has written one of the most powerful books about rape. She was she maybe still is a journalist, but during her time as a journalist, she went on a story, was late, and ended up being raped by someone who encountered her alone in the place where she was supposed to be meeting people. And it is a story that for the first time made me realize that rape is not just an assault. It is much more than that. And it's a powerful reason why it should be treated differently than other crimes. She did a great job. So say hi to her for me, and everybody should read her.
The name of her book is I Will Find You, and it's Joanna Connors.
Yes. Yes. Thank you for mentioning that. Thank you for being with us today.
Okay. Good to see you, Jill.
Good to see you.